You don't
oh
get
my
2
God.
thumbs up. It's Siskel and Ebert.
No, we
no,
definitely.
You said 3 thumbs up.
There
It's
are 3
time
of us
to-
on the show, Rich.
But wouldn't it be 6 thumbs up then?
No, you only put up
You
1
know,
thumbs.
I
Oh my
got to be
God.
honest. I
can't
definitely
believe we're
feel
having
like
to
we were doing so well.
We
Like,
were doing really well.
I'm
could've-
gonna cut
could've just-
before this.
You do
the
realize
plug.
that Siskel
All right,
and
can I
Ebert each
stop it
held
then,
up
Rich?
1 thumb each.
Rich, can I stop recording?
Yeah, we can stop. I don't know who those people are.
What? Oh my God. And welcome to another episode of Even More Mashed Up, the pop culture podcast featuring 2 professors and a Rich talking about all things pop culture. I'm Patrick.
Hey, and I'm Alan, and for maybe first-time listeners joining us who don't really know who we are, welcome to a podcast that takes up topics so diverse that it often feels like we're talking about everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah, all right. I like that. All right, well, good night, folks.
Yeah, I said that.
Speaking of which,
So yes, today's topic is everything, everywhere, all at once.
yes.
Indeed.
So where would you like to? I mean, it is a film about the multiverse, and Alan usually has questions about the
Multiverse
multiverse.
potential of a sorts a time travel.
Yeah. So
In a
I also
way.
have questions for Alan about the multiverse.
Which
Exciting.
I'm looking forward to.
Yes. So, Alan, do you want to start with your multiverse questions, or I can start with mine, or?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I know that I have a reputation for not liking multiversal stuff, but this was
In
actually...
that you generally say you don't like them when we talk about them, yes.
Well, time travel especially. Multiverses on
Understandably
and
so.
off. You know, I think I actually understand, and I mean, I'm almost afraid to say this out loud, but I think I understand the multiversal, interdimensional kind of travel here. Like, tell me if I'm not getting it right, Patrick. The basic idea is that every decision you make creates kind of branched off universes. And
Yes.
if that's my understanding, I mean, I understood that as a kindergartner. I could remember when I was like in kindergarten, sitting, like being outside my house in the backyard, thinking if I did something so unexpectedly unique, I could actually create a branched reality. Like, this is exactly how I thought about the world when I was 5 years old.
Well, I mean, that's generally true of almost
Yeah,
every multiverse is based on, I mean, that's why they're alternate realities. They're realities in which you did something different or alternate to what you did. And so that's fairly common to
usually-
all multiverses.
Yeah. Now,
So
usually
it seems-
most movies make a big deal about it, where it's like, oh, you saved somebody, you didn't save somebody, as opposed to, you got a paper cut or you didn't get a paper cut.
True, the decisions do tend to be more monumental
yeah.
in Loki killed Thor, Loki didn't kill Thor.
Yeah.
Type stuff, so.
When in realities, if you did, like in this film shows that, like, the multiverse is literally every minute decision, We start a minute later recording the podcast, hypothetically that's another reality,
Yes.
which might be perfectly the same, except for the one thing, or it might be that when the apocalypse happens.
So yeah, so that concept of the multiverse, I think, is fairly common amongst all of them. They're all basically branch realities based on things that were different.
Okay, so, like, then I guess I don't really have any questions. Like, it seems to make sense to me. Like, again, since the
All
time I
right.
was like 5, this
See,
is
I
kind of
thought
how
you
I
had
thought about
issues
it.
with how they accessed those multiverses, or those dimensions. One with the sort of nonsense kind of things they had to do, but then also with the sort of Google glasses, or not Google glasses, earpieces they needed to kind of access them.
Yeah, I don't know. It didn't really bother me. at all.
Well, I mean, it's possible. We're not actually traveling necessarily to any of these multiverses. She's just able to tap into them.
Yeah, or you are slightly traveling to them in that you can perceive the universe through that other person, your doppelganger, so to speak. Yeah,
it's
you
basically
yourself
that's basically like dreamwalking in Multiverse of Madness.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, and you can kind of control it too a bit. Yeah. I guess you could argue that the villain travels a bunch. Maybe.
Yeah, actually, a good question. I'm not sure if she. I mean,
and I guess
we know she at least. I guess she at least travels to Evelyn's world because she killed the Evelyn in her world, and then she's in.
But is she traveling, or is she simply taking over the body in that dimension?
Actually, right. She is just taking over the body because it is Joy's body, so she is. She's more like a disembodied
it could be
type thing.
It almost the way you see stuff happening is extremely almost confusing because stuff will shift like crazy, but like it all seems to stick within the rule. It doesn't introduce a ton of like different ideas about it. It's not like there's a million different gadgets and stuff and people are like altering it. Like it's all very consistent in the rules. Despite how many films will cover multiverse or time travel or teleporting or whatever, like this one seems to be very focused in like what happens. It doesn't drop stuff at the last minute as like a MacGuffin to completely break everything, or undo all the plot.
So, Alan.
Yes.
Which of the verses in Everything All at Once was your favorite?
Oh,
that was one of my. I have two questions for you. That was the first question. Which one was your favorite?
The one where I don't even what's it called. The one that we begin in would be my favorite.
Oh, okay.
So like the quote unquote prime of sorts.
Well, you can't call it prime though, right? Because there's alpha. Like whatever it is.
In terms of the audience viewpoint, I guess, because we spend the most time in it.
Yeah, honestly, to me, like there was so much that I loved about this movie, and there was so much about this movie that made me think about bigger issues or like topics that I wrestle with a lot as a historian. I didn't get too bogged down, I guess, in the multiversal science of it all. It was a very weird experience for me that way.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would have been my favorite anyway.
Yeah. I liked the one where they were rocks.
Well, that would be a close second. I mean, it was fun.
Yeah,
that was
especially
fun.
how it was introduced, where it's just like pure silence.
Yep. And then when they had when she turned around and had the googly eyes on the rock, I might have laughed out loud.
Yeah, yeah. And also just it's like, don't worry about that, just be a rock. And it's like, and it was, I don't know, it was just like, I think a lot of us could kind of connect to that idea of like being able to just teleport somewhere where you're just a rock and like there's, silence in your life for a moment as well.
Being a rock would be great.
Right? Like, but also even the Google, I love like all the callbacks to stuff where, you see Evelyn eventually take all the things she hates in her life in the sort of first dimension, and comes to love it. Like the googly eyes. She hates it to put everywhere. And then it's like she puts them on herself because that's part of her now. In the rocks or whatever.
So then my second question for Alan, which I think I know the answer to this already. Where would you rank the use of the multiverse in this film versus the MCU and Flash?
Well, I mean, obviously Flash is garbage, so...
Yeah, lowest of the low.
That can be dismissed, I think, pretty quickly. To me, the comparison is an odd one. Like, to me, the multiverse, the way Marvel uses it, is kind of a gimmick and a special effects driven thing and a nostalgia driven thing. And I thought like the multiverse here is actually used to explore maybe more profound questions about who we are and why our lives matter. So I think this movie transcends anything that Marvel is kind of doing with the multiverse to me.
You know, and how uniquely it'll show it. You know, where like the one time in Evelyn's fighting her quote unquote daughter, you know, and then in that like one dimension where they're like in the trees and the way like they're almost trying to traditional robes, and you just see her like hold out a hand and like warp through like a million different objects and stuff. You know, she's talking about how like everything's just particles or whatever. Like one, it was very almost sort of subtle. It wasn't like a big deal or whatever, but it was also like that idea that if you really truly were connected to the multiverse, like you would just pick, like almost like a video game, you would just pick something to use as a weapon, like innately, instead of, you know, having to concentrate and like cast a spell and stuff. Like it would just sort of happen. You know, I thought that the use of like the multiverse also seemed to be more natural.
I hadn't really thought about it, I guess, in that way. Maybe. You know, like...
Because when you think of the MCU, like, you know, again with Doctor Strange, like it's you know, America Chavez has to cast like a portal, and it's a big deal to travel through it. You know, they're being tossed about and stuff, and it's like, you know, you especially when she's at the villain, like she seems so much more powerful because it's like you can't hide from her. You know, in an you know, she twists her head and goes through 5 different dimensions. You know, without even a thought. You know, she can be anywhere, or be anything, or have anything in her hand at a moment's notice.
Yeah. I don't know, Patrick, what's your take on that?
On...
like the use of the multiverse.
I kind of like Alan. I think it was more a device for talking about bigger things that ultimately, as much as, you know, the film was sort of billed as being sort of about this, you know, the multiverse and Evelyn sort of traveling or you know, crossing into it in one way or another. It seemed to me that ultimately the film was not really about the multiverse. The multiverse was more a device that the film used to talk about bigger issues. You know,
and
relating to issues of well, relating to a lot. There's any number of things that I think you know, one of the things that struck me about the film is the way that in terms of the big issues or questions that it's sort of asking about, is that it works on a number of different levels.
I totally agree, Patrick. This movie, and I don't, like, again, I don't want to just bash Marvel, but like I've been, you know, obviously a little at sea with Marvel for a while, waiting for, you know, them to make that next movie that moved me in some way. But this movie, at like several points, flat out made me want to cry. I thought, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful story. It was beautiful cinematography. It had this allegorical power to it. And, you know, to me, like, as much as we might kind of wrestle with like the multiverse and all the superhero-y kinds of things that sometimes, you know, we have a lot of fun kind of getting sidetracked into, to me, like, this was a film that had so much to say about, like, what does it mean to be Chinese American or Asian American or an immigrant, or really, frankly, like, what does it mean to be human in really interesting ways? And, you know, maybe I loved it a little bit too much that way, because I felt like it was very much speaking to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of describing it. Because,
I
thought, look, I think one of the things is, and again, I think this is essentially saying the same thing, but the film both works allegorically, I think, as you said, Alan, to say some things about the human condition in general.
Right.
But it also works in a lot of specific and concrete ways to talk about immigration and Asian American identity or identities.
Yeah, but that's what makes it so powerful in a way, is that it can be very specific and concrete, but it's also universal in a way that builds a kind of empathy or a sympathy or an enhanced desire to better understand experiences that seem so unlike your own, but end up maybe being not as unlike your own as you might imagine them to be.
Yeah, like there's no one who's truly evil in the movie when you think about it to a point. Like even the iOS agent, as the movie goes on, like, they just connect and they realize that, like, they're just people. When Evelyn, and even in the one dimension, as funny as it is with the hot dog fingers things, like, they find, sort of true love with that. Like, I love that idea. Like you saying that, like, everyone can be like everyone can kind of be understood, sort of, Well,
I think, yeah, and there's I think so much to unpack in this. This movie is like, it's smart and it's sympathetic and it's moving and it's funny and it's beautiful and it's like full of action and it's well choreographed. I'll say at the front, because it's gonna obviously lead through to everything I say. I just thought this was a really amazing film on a lot of different levels.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Though I will say there's at least one aspect of the film, and it's kind of where the allegorical and the more literal elements of the film overlap a bit, where I do have a little bit of a concern, if not a critique, of what the film is saying. That there's a little bit that I think the allegory, I think, has some potentially problematic, or I should say the allegory as I see it, because we may be talking about different allegories, but the allegory as I see it, there's some ways in which that what it does has some potentially problematic elements to it.
I think that there are, and I don't know if we're heading in the same direction or not. I think there are some criticisms, or some concerns at least, to be levied. But do you want to start with what we think the film does well, and then kind of lead to those problems?
Sure. Yeah, that seems good.
So for me, one of the things, like, as an Asian American historian, that I'm always interested in when a show like this, kind of comes across the popular consciousness, is the idea of the model minority stereotype. That often has been used to kind of confine and oversimplify the Asian American experience in America.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hello? I thought you were still going.
Oh no. So sorry.
No, yeah.
At a distance, it's hard to tell. I was just trying to give some space for people to jump in. So, like, the model minority is the idea, of course, that it kind of originates with Japanese Americans in the 1960s, and it comes from a conservative who's writing really to criticize African Americans for not having risen in society. And he points to Japanese Americans, and he says of Japanese Americans, look at Japanese Americans. During World War II, they were thrown into these government-run concentration camps, and yet they remained faithful in America. And when the war was over and they escaped the camps, they worked hard and they got college educations and they got, professional and doctoral educations, and they kind of succeeded in American society. They were climbing economically. They were marrying outside their ethnic group at rates that were much larger than other ethnic and racial groups. And so, kind of under the guise of praising what Japanese Americans had accomplished, what he was really doing was criticizing all of the other minority groups that hadn't achieved in the same way. And that's problematic. But it's also, of course, further problematic in presenting successful Japanese Americans or successful Asian Americans is thus typical of all Asian Americans. And of course, there's incredible diversity of experience and whatnot within the Asian American community as well. And I thought that this movie actually worked in a quiet way to kind of dismantle that model minority stereotype, to try to present not model minorities that you would typically see Asian Americans portraying, maybe in a mainstream American film, but instead to show real human beings instead.
Yeah, well, and I think that the point you made about, and I think this might be one of the reasons why the film is particularly effective in these things, that a lot of the stuff that it's doing with, race and identity and things like the model minority. As you said, it's very quiet. It's definitely there, but it's done in a very subtle and deft way, I would say. And in some ways, the multiverse is almost kind of serving as cover for some of that.
That's a nice point.
It engages with some of these issues of like you said, the model minority. Because we see, I mean, the first time we see Evelyn in the film is she's sitting at the table with all of her receipts.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And, it gives us a sense of just how hard she's working.
Right.
And not having that so-called model minority success.
Right. And in that opening, she's surrounded not only by the paperwork, but kind of like the film is almost jarringly chaotic as it opens, right? Because she's not just juggling the paperwork. Her father is visiting and he's really judgmental, and the ceiling needs painting and the washing machines are broken and somebody's drying their sneakers, and she doesn't know where the laundry orders are, and she's trying to make food, and she's got a daughter who's gay and she's wrestling with that. Like it just it was almost overwhelming to me. And I thought it was really effective in that way, and the way it just kind of like it drops you right into the middle of the maelstrom, right? That is her life.
I actually had to pause the movie at that point just for a second because I was like, I had to take a step back.
Yeah, I almost started the movie over a few minutes in because I had that same kind of sense of being overwhelmed like you did.
And I must have missed a bunch of stuff or something.
And I was having trouble following some of it.
Right, and that's intentional, right? On Daniel's part, they're making the movie they want you to feel that. Like that's step one, I think, in building the empathy that I think they're wanting us to build. But it's very disorienting. I agree with both of you.
Yeah. So I agree. Yeah, that it's again, it's one of the things the film does very effectively. Another thing that kind of similar. Another thing that I really thought the film did well with. As someone who teaches, ethnic American literature and does a great deal with Asian American, one of the things that we very clearly see in this film is, the struggle with the different generations of.
That's actually next on my list. Yeah.
Yeah. Is the Chinese American that you've got. And again, it's something that's very subtle. Is you've got, particularly in the early parts of the film, it becomes a little bit more pronounced at the end when you kind of see Evelyn, talking directly to her father about the ways in which that she was sort of traumatized by him, and then also addressing the ways in which that she sort of traumatized Joy. But you've got 3 generations of Chinese Americans in there, and you've got Joy. Joy in particular stood out to me as a very common sort of character that we see of, the young Chinese American that's sort of caught between contemporary culture and values and, the values from her parents, and her parents' Chinese traditions and values that she's, a lot of her struggle seemed to be between those. One of the things that the film more and more reminded me of was Maxine Hung Kingston's Woman Warrior. That there was a lot of, I could see teaching these two works right next to each other.
Yeah. Well, in many ways,
really do inform.
Yeah, Joy's tattoo is a great example of that, I think, right? Because it's a tattoo that's trying to capture some sense of her family's history, but totally alienates her mom. Yeah. So there's like that tension. And thinking about Asian American literature, or in my case, Asian American history, or immigration history more broadly, but often especially Asian American history. It often is defined by generation. Right? We think about it in terms of generations, and in this case, I think the movie does a wonderful semi-concrete, but, largely allegorical telling of that story, that her father, Gong Gong, right, is completely distanced from his daughter and her family. And it's not just the physical distance. When he arrives in the United States, he's totally out of place. He can't speak English. He doesn't understand the culture. He goes to the IRS building, with the family because they kind of have to. And he has no idea what's going on. He's completely out of touch. And so I think thinking about immigration as that kind of psychic and emotional rupture is a powerful way of reminding people. Like, we live in a current place where maybe sympathy for immigrants isn't broadly felt in this country, but maybe understanding those kinds of ruptures is a way of getting people to think more sympathetically about just what does it mean, you know, to leave your father or to be left behind by your daughter.
Yeah. Well, and that moment where Evelyn says to her father, you know, how could you, I can't remember the exact line, but, you know, how could you let me go so easily, or how could you, you know, abandon me so easy? Like, that was heartbreaking. Like, that moment
Absolutely.
was,
Yeah.
again, one of the, for me, probably one of the most powerful moments in the film. And again, you see, again, as we've seen it again, you know, this film is in kind of the same, camp as, you know, Turning Red, as Encanto, that this kind of intergenerational trauma within, in this case, Chinese Americans, but we've seen it, you know, in Turning Red with other Canadian Asian family. We've seen it in Encanto with a Latino family, that we've got this pattern of kind of intergenerational trauma that's coming up a lot in recent films by, ethnic American creators. That as you said, it's not unique to Chinese and Asian American. It is really kind of part of the immigration experience, and you see it both in the history and the literature. The as you said, the rupture and the kind of trauma that results from the misunderstanding across generations.
Yeah, and I think another way that it then functions to kind of build maybe potentially a broader empathy is thinking about then the first generation in the States. That would be Evelyn and Waymond in this case, right? Who come with these dreams of economic and social success, right? But instead, like, they come to this idea that, like, the streets are literally paved with gold. But what they find instead when they get to the States are economic struggles. And certainly kind of economic struggles in the way in which it's so hard to get ahead, and the way in which the system hems you in, becomes a story that lots of Americans can understand. Right? That those economic struggles then have consequences, that the marriage isn't working, you know, it's not romantically working the way it used to. There are divorce papers to be signed, you know, and then also showing the parents struggling to understand joy, like to try to understand their daughter, I think is again a way in which the very concrete story becomes increasingly universal in the way the way in which the film presents it.
Yeah, well, and even, you know, in some ways the film, I think, also engages, again, very kind of subtly with some particularly Asian American stereotypes. I mean, obviously, you know, the entire situation of the family that they're working a laundromat puts them within kind of that a very stereotypical setting. You know,
and yet, Patrick, Evelyn is very much a tiger mom kind of stereotype.
That's where I was going
in some
next,
ways, right?
Evelyn's a tiger mom, and Waymond is somewhat of that emasculated Asian American male. That is again a perpetual. Like, there's particularly early in the film, that there's a kind of way in which that he comes off as kind of an emasculated figure.
No,
I think at the
absolutely
the film kind of works away from. I actually read the divorce papers differently, in that I don't think Waymond actually wanted to get this paper signed.
No.
I think he wanted he was using it basically because that was the only way he could get Evelyn to pay attention to him.
Yeah, that's right.
The issues of
he never intended to get a divorce.
That's what I'm saying, right? When the divorce papers show up, like it's a sign that the marriage isn't working. It's not that Waymond wants a divorce, but it's the only way that he can try to jolt his marriage back to kind of the romantic ideal and, you know, the familial ideal that he has. But like, it's interesting, kind of, it takes a bunch of stereotypes and mashes them together, because when you think of the tiger mom stereotype, that's usually associated with upwardly mobile, model minority style families. in the Asian American community. And so it's just, to me, it's interesting because you're right, Patrick. There are all of these stereotypes that oftentimes we would come and we would be deeply critical of. But I think with each of them, the filmmaker wants us to then take a second look and start unpacking and digging a little bit deeper underneath the surface to try to see humanity underneath it.
Yeah, I was going to say much the same thing is that even though there are stereotypes recognizable in each of the characters, particularly the older generations,
right?
The characters are never defined just as the stereotype. Like, there are elements of Evelyn that are the tiger mom, but she's not just the tiger mom. And I think, again, it's to the filmmaker's credit that, as I think you were just kind of saying, the character's humanity always shines through the stereotypes. Like, it's the humanity of the characters that I think, kind of overwhelms the stereotypes, not the stereotypes overwhelming
and
the humanity. I think that's something that the filmmakers, another thing that the filmmakers, I would say, deserve credit for, is that they're able to engage with stereotypes without reducing the characters to stereotypes.
Well, and in a way that works really well to shatter the stereotypes, because if like you're drawn in, you're like, oh, it's a tiger mom and emasculated dad, right? And then all of a sudden, like within 10 minutes, you're like, you start to realize, whoa, like they're way more than this superficial understanding that perhaps society and history and literature have too often encouraged us to have about these people.
Well, and I think the chaos at the beginning kind of feeds into that, because you're struggling so much to keep up with what's going on that you can't help but see these characters and their lives as multifaceted and complex, as opposed to, reductive and simplified. Like, I think that's another effective bit of the opening, is that you're kind of having to grapple with them and their situation in ways that also, I think, allows them to transcend stereotypes, even as the film engages with them.
There's a great tension there, I think, that works. And then to finish the generational real quick, I think Joy, as you mentioned earlier, Patrick, makes loads of sense as a second generation or first generation born in the United States.
Oh yeah.
Kind of character, trying to figure out, like, trying to make her way, trying to figure out, like, just exactly, she's in this liminal space between immigrant and American. And, like, how do I make that work? And I'm also being pushed by my parents in certain ways, and there's all these expectations being loaded on me. Well, I thought one of the really great moments in the film is when Evelyn is kind of, like, piecing things together. She initially blames Jobu for all of what she sees as Joy's bad choices. Joy has chosen to be gay.
This monster has to get out of her.
Right. Like it's the monster that has caused her daughter's queerness. It's the monster that caused her daughter to quit college. It's the monster that convinced her daughter to get the tattoo. I mean, she eventually learns, like, differently. Like the lesson does settle in for her. But I thought it was a very real and human moment where she immediately doesn't want to blame herself,
right,
or the situation into which she's kind of brought her daughter, but instead wants to kind of find some external source to blame.
Yeah.
So that brings me to a fair or foul, Patrick, that I wanted to drop in a little early, because it's about kind of Evelyn and her story, and I think a lot of what we've been talking about. So maybe this will just confirm it, but I'm interested to what you think. So this is from Ben Travis at Empire, and he's writing about he's writing about Evelyn. He says, quote, "There is a specificity in her story, but there is universality in the way in which she feels, overwhelmed by her life, consumed by everything everywhere all at once. She has a business to run, taxes to file, customers to please, a father to live up to, a husband to argue with, and most importantly, a daughter that she increasingly cannot relate to." So I'm specifically interested in your response to the idea of the specificity and the universality.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. And again, it's part of why this film it's just a really well done film. Is as we talked about that like so much of the film works on those levels of universality and specificity. With all of the characters and yeah, there is something that, and again, you can kind of, again, it's even though the show or the film is dressed up in a lot of trappings of Chinese American, Asian American, immigrant American existence, Evelyn is also recognizably a mom,
right?
And so the feeling, and so the feelings that she's going through with her daughter, you know, they can be engaged with on the level of, as we've been talking about, kind of between the generations of Asian American moms and daughters, but also I think works on the level of moms and daughters generally. And the way that again, I think the universality and the specificity kind of work together in that the universality of some of what the film deals with sort of masks some of the specificity that would have a lot of people basically, you know, that would have a lot of people say, oh, this is just another, you know, this film's another example of wokeness, you know, oh, everything's bad in America if you're not white, all those, like, it
another didactic lesson from Hollywood. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
I think it does a very good job, I think, of using kind of universal aspects of particularly relationships and situations in the film, but that also allows them to talk about things very specific to Asian and Asian American experience.
Right.
And so again, it's something that I think the film. I think the description there, in what you read, I think is it might be one of the most fair things you've ever brought to the show.
Wow. I usually do try to bring something that will trip you up. But you know, another way that the specific and the universal work. I mean, Rich talked about the IRS a bit. Like the IRS kind of functions this way, the same way, right? Like we can think about it as just like this impenetrable enemy. We all understand that. But the IRS in this film is also kind of like the system, right? It's a system that confronts uncomprehending immigrants with a set of rules and regulations and language that's just, you know, impenetrable for them. It's uncaring. It's indifferent. It could not care less about the people that get caught up in it. And that was one of the things I liked
about the way the film ended.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if what struck me at the end is when Deidre was the IRS agent's name, right?
Oh, right.
Yes.
When she says something to Waymond about, well, it's really great you've listened to me, but you've also not listened to me, and then starts to complain about, like, here's the next thing you have to do. And I was like, the kind of the way in which that bureaucracy and that insensitivity of the system remains. That
it's going to grind on.
Yeah, it's gonna like none of that has really changed. Like they've made a slight bit of headway, but kind of the way in which that the system still remains in place. I don't want to say untroubled, because it is troubled in the way that it is still there and largely unchanging. But that was a moment that I was like another moment that I really, a very specific moment in the film that I thought worked really well. I'm like, yeah, that is exactly how the system works. That they are, you know, they've eked out maybe just a tiny little bit more than they had, but they're still in a system that is kind of stacked against them and you know, working against them with its rules on bureaucracy. Because that line about you've listened to me and not listened to me, I was like, yeah, that sums up the system. It's
like going to the DMV, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think it's another wise choice, because, I mean, who doesn't hate the IRS? And I say that as someone whose dad worked for the IRS for 35 years. You know, a universal hatred of the IRS is another thing that this film plays on very successfully. Because, you know, again, we all would feel that way during an audit. It's not that this is unique to Evelyn and her family. There are ways in which that the situation with the IRS does reflect uniquely on their experience as Asian Americans, but it also works really well because no one wants to be audited by the IRS, and no one imagines that being a pleasant possibility. And we probably all would imagine wanting to punch one in the face.
Yeah.
Yeah. That example at the end is really important to me because I think one of the dangers of this film is that it ends with like too happy an ending.
That's where my critique of the allegory comes into that somewhat.
Yeah, I think that's, if I have a complaint, it's that the film runs that risk, and I'm not sure that Jamie Lee Curtis saying, "Hey, you listened but you didn't," kind of like leaves enough of reality that's confronting them in it. But just a quick shout out, like Jamie Lee Curtis is pretty excellent in this film, right? To me, she's taken
everyone's excellent in this film. Like I would not, but yeah, Jamie Lee Curtis does a great job as the IRS. Speaking of someone, my dad was a collection agent for 35 years.
Yeah,
at the IRS, he retired when they want to put him in charge of collection and audit. I'm like, oh my god, like could they give you the two worst things to do? Because literally that's why he retired. He was like, yeah, no, I don't want to be in charge of those two things. I'm like, who would?
No, well, who would? Jamie Lee Curtis, who's like channeling.
And I say this, Jamie Lee Curtis, not the character.
Well, because to me, she's really channeling Scream Queens energy, like Scream Queens 1, like season 1 energy. She's just
slightly more nuanced and subtle than Scream Queens.
Yeah, but she's having so much freaking fun in this movie.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just like her performance.
If I were Jamie Lee Curtis and where I am in my career, like I would only be doing stuff that's fun. Like what else is there to do at this point if you're Jamie Lee Curtis? Like
who cares about money at this point?
You've had a career. Like do stuff that's fun.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Do action scenes where you're still in like a knit sweater, jumping, off of stairs or whatever.
That's a great moment. It's a great moment that makes it feel like that action adventure film, but just serves to kind of disguise and add some humor to, I think, the more profound questions.
Yeah. Well, and the absurdity of the film.
Yes.
In pursuit of more profound questions. The other thing it reminded me a lot of was Sorry to Bother You in the kind of the absurdist elements.
There's no way, I think, not to make that comparison. Like as I was watching and as I was writing notes several times, it's films that are using the same kinds of techniques, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
To get after bigger issues. But the IRS is also great, real quickly, just because I don't want to forget this point, because of the way it uses language, right? It's not just the English language that kind of trips up Evelyn and Waymond, but when they get in that building and it's like all the technical language that they're trying to digest, especially without Joy, who is the only person that has any hope of kind of translating what's actually happening, is, I think, another moment where you can't help but sympathize with people who are caught in such a ridiculous and, in a way, violent system.
Yeah, well, and it's another way that it very clearly positions Joy between the different cultures. Like, she's the one that has to translate for her parents what the American culture, the American institution is saying, and the way in which that means Joy has to kind of understand that bureaucratic language, which is completely foreign to her as well.
Right.
But it's another moment that kind of captures the way in which that Joy, very ironically named, is sort of trapped in between worlds. Right. If it's not too much in a movie about the multiverse to call them worlds.
Right. Well, but what a great metaphor, right? Like instead of worrying about the the worlds that we're like dissecting on the MCU big screen, like let's worry about the worlds that actually exist in the world in which we live. And to me, another way it does that, Patrick, is code switching, which we talked about a little bit with the Ms. Marvel show on Disney Plus, right? We both thought it worked pretty well there. It felt organic. I thought this was like Ms. Marvel, but on steroids in a good way.
Oh, particularly at the beginning of the film. The code switching at the beginning of the film, I was like, because number one, I think when it first started, it gave me the option of doing subtitles.
Right.
And I didn't do the subtitles, but then I was very happy that it still had the subtitles, because that first conversation between Evelyn and Waymond, where they're literally going back and forth in the middle of sentences between Chinese and English like that. I mean, that was the code switching was another thing that adds to the chaos, but was again something that that felt very organic to the characters.
Yeah, it felt real and specific and also universal, right? Because of the way in which those languages kind of bleed into each other and clash against each other, sometimes literally in the same sentence.
Yeah.
I think really captures a sense of the rupture that we were talking about earlier, or kind of the disjuncture between China and America, between American society and the Chinese American home, like within the Chinese American family. I just thought the code switching was a brilliant way to kind of capture kind of the conflicting identities and outlooks that exist for a Chinese American or an immigrant family.
Well, and along the same lines, the point you just made about the Chinese American home, we kind of think of and maybe sort of see represented in film and literature, the Chinese American home as a kind of space or an enclave sort of separate from, the American society that it's in.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point.
And here we see that the Chinese American home is no safe space. Like it's been as per, I mean, the receipts on the table, the language that they're having to use, they're talking about the IRS stuff, so they're having to use that kind of language.
Yep. That the customers they have to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah. Their home is not that kind of a refuge. Their home is as, penetrated by, the American culture that they're in, that just makes Joy's role as translator, even more interesting. Because even when Joy's not there, we see them in the home having to still negotiate between cultures.
Right.
And sort of adding to the everything that is in their lives.
Right. And you understand as a consequence why Joy dropped out of college. Mm-hmm. And how difficult it is for a kid, or a young woman in that situation to have to juggle all that she's juggling on top of the everyday stuff that people are juggling. Mm-hmm. And so it adds up to this world in which Evelyn can be a brilliant woman in some ways, but be a failing businesswoman, where she can be a loving mother, but also a mother who really struggles to express it in an effective way to her daughter.
And a loving mother, but also a mother who traumatizes her daughter.
Right. Yeah.
Because, there's that scene at the beginning where she wants to say something else to Joy, but what she says is you're getting fat or something to that effect. And that there was something else she was going to say and couldn't say it.
Right. Right. No, I think absolutely. And that kind of bleeds into the philosophical debate between Jobu and Evelyn in some ways, right? That what Jobu thinks she's learned once she's experienced everything is that nothing matters, right? That humanity is just, as she puts it, small and stupid. Mm-hmm. And that Evelyn responds eventually kind of with Wayman's guidance in a way, that amidst all of the smallness and the stupidity, it's kindness. Mm-hmm. It's understanding that we're all together in it, right? That makes the difference.
Yeah, though that's the place where I start to see some cracks in what the film is doing. Because I would actually, there's actually, I agree with you on Joy and Wayman that they kind of represent, that Joy is despair in the face of, how nothing matters. And Wayman is, kindness.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And on a very kind of general philosophical level, I found in the same way that when I watched Soul, I kind of had a the message of that film. I had a profound effect on me, and kind of made me start rethinking things.
Yeah.
The general idea of it's important to remain kind even in the face of all the shit that you have to deal with.
Yeah.
That worked really well for me. It's when you start to think about that within the context of Asian American experience. Because the third point on that continuum is Evelyn for much of the film, which is fighting, which is war, which is violence.
Right. Yes.
And on the philosophical level, Evelyn kind of embracing kindness over fighting, totally get.
Right, or fighting with kindness, yeah.
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 But as a politics, the idea of Asian Americans the film kind of advocating a not fighting or not struggling against the system, not, don't despair, don't fight, and ends with kind of this idea of kindness, that felt a little kind of politically empty to me. Like it's be nice to others as you're being ground down by the system. Don't fight the system. That was where I felt like the message of the film got a little bit mixed, because I'm like, no, you need to fight against the system as well. Like there's different kinds of fighting. So that was where I felt the film kind of not in a way that ruined the film for me or anything, but was a spot where I was just like, I get what they were going for on kind of as you said, kind of a philosophical or allegorical level.
Yeah.
But on the level of the reality of the film and Asian American experience, I was kind of like, I don't know if that message works for me.
So let me respond to that by saying that I have a huge blind spot here, in part revealed by the tattoo that I have on my arm, right, which is the King's X song, "We Were Born to Be Loved," right, which I think is the fundamental truth of life, is that like every one of us was born to be loved, and that comes out of my Quaker faith and my pacifism. And so, as you can imagine, Patrick, like the idea of, in some ways, I think Waymond presents a pacifist position. But here's the best I can do to argue against where you're coming from. Being a pacifist, or maybe the translation to kindness, maybe I'm reading too much of my own personal experience in, but being a pacifist doesn't mean not fighting. It means resisting in certain kinds of ways against injustice. And in some ways, you might argue that Evelyn, or let me try to make the argument, at the end of the film, Evelyn hasn't adopted Waymond's approach, because Waymond just makes cookies for people, and hopes that that's gonna fix things. But she's no longer just fighting with violence as before, but she's fighting by kind of giving people closure or what they need, right? By treating
like
them
a deeper want that actually helps them in a way, as opposed to like
so
forgetting the issues, dealing with the issues.
Yeah, like the resistance doesn't have to be physical. And in fact, my philosophical position in life is that physical resistance inevitably falls short of what needs to be achieved to actually build something better, which isn't to say you don't fight back, but it's about finding different ways to resist. And could I make the argument that by the end, Evelyn has found a different way to fight? It's not that the movie's saying, don't fight. The movie's saying, find more effective ways to resist.
Because, again, you could argue that when she fights, quote unquote, with kindness at the end, nobody's attacking her anymore, but no one's dead either. No one's injured.
Right. And again,
it gets the same result without hurting people in a sense.
Yeah. And I understand that I'm presenting this position, like, not as a history professor, but as a human being with a set of religious beliefs about the world. But does my argument make any sense at all, Patrick, or do you remain?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. I think the issue, and I absolutely see what you're saying. And as Rich just brought up, when she's defeating, Gogo's army by, as you said, sort of giving them what they want,
or what they need,
or what they need. I see all of that. My issue is translating that into and maybe this is a better way of phrasing is that all makes sense within the struggle against Jobu Tupaki and all of that, but I don't know that translates to the situation within American society, because and again, this is maybe where what I just praised the film for is also where it runs into trouble. That, we end up almost exactly where we began, with them in the IRS office. Deidre is only talking to Waymond. Evelyn is daydreaming again, and then is sort of brought back to reality. And we kind of end up with that situation in, where we're back to Waymond and, making people cookies and being nice and being kind. No, I don't know that the film, and maybe it's just a place that the film doesn't go, is I don't know. I don't know that within the lived reality of the characters, it gives us the equivalent of the alternative that's very clearly there within, like, it doesn't give us the equivalent of, Evelyn giving them what they need to defeat Gogo. It doesn't really give us the equivalent, and maybe it can't, but it doesn't really give us an equivalent of that within the lived experience. And so that's where I'm kind of like, in the end, for me, I'm kind of left with, yes, that's a really nice message. Sort of that message of kindness is exactly what I identified with as the film.
Right.
But it's one thing for the film to work on that level for me and again, to make it, as a white middle class, man. But I don't know that it as clearly offers an alternative for, the Asian Americans in the film and thus what they represent. So I absolutely agree with you that's there in the metaphor. I don't know that we get it in the reality of the film. And maybe part of the issue is that you can't, because how do you actually represent what the alternative is within the reality of the characters? Maybe it's just a place where, it's something that's just kind of impossible to imagine. But I see exactly what you're going for, Alan. But
just real quickly, because it's the imagination you just said that I think is really important. I think what the film leaves us with is this allegorical answer that you're right, doesn't exist in the real world, right? Like, even if we step outside of the character world of the movie, it doesn't exist in the world in which we live. Mm-hmm. But then the film can be understood as a call to use our imaginations to do something different. Like, the film could be saying, it's kind of like when we talked about In the Heights, you talked about the way in which this very vibrant community was cut off from everything else, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe the film is saying, I want to believe that the filmmakers are saying, okay, we can't end with a perfectly happy ending. And it's impossible, right? Because even in the allegory, Evelyn has a level of power that Asian Americans don't have in American society, right? Sure. They don't have that power to leverage. But if the film's not made just for Asian Americans, but it's made for all of us, collectively, maybe we do have the power, if we would choose to imagine a better way of building the world and changing the world, to do something different. But I know this is very airy and idealistic, but you're more the realist in this, of the two of us, and I'm more the guy that continues to want to dream something different sometimes.
Yeah, no, and I think what I would like is and part of it too is I think, again, it's the way that the film ends, with everything kind of back, in a way, everything's kind of back to how it was. And even kind of the Evelyn daydreaming and then coming back to reality and saying, oh no, I was paying attention. I wish maybe there was something a little bit different there, like something that had showed a change in Evelyn, or even just, it's not Deidre talking to Waymond again, it's Deidre talking to Evelyn. Like, if there was some
or Joy even
little change that suggested that Evelyn, that things were a little bit different. So and maybe I'm just being completely unfair, because I'm also saying, the fact that nothing changed at the end I also liked. So maybe I'm just being completely unfair to the film. Expecting it to do everything. I absolutely see what you're saying, Alan. Is the call for the call for us to kind of imagine more. I maybe wish that the call itself was maybe a little bit more concrete, and maybe just giving us a tiny bit more of an indication that particularly Evelyn's positioning within the system, or how she's responding to being within the system has changed, because it seemed a little bit too much the same as she's always been.
Well, then let me pitch a different. Yeah, let me pitch a different reading of it to you then. That it's not a call that the filmmakers are making, that the filmmakers are trapped like the rest of us are in not allowing ourselves or not having the imagination to do something different. Look, if the movie ended...
that makes it it makes it so much more depressing a film than I want it to be.
Well,
you could even argue that
at the depressing can lead us to optimism. Sorry, Rich, go ahead.
No. I was saying you could even argue at the end when she's like distracted, it's a foreshadowing that, you know, this life, because they even say sort of like, or Joy even says, you know, there's so much happening in your head and whatnot. There's only going to be brief bits of like calm, that when she's distracted and hearing all this stuff, that's that foreshadowing of her, you know, realizing that she's only going to have moments in her life that she can be present, because she's going to be constantly hearing all of the other universes happening.
Oh, that's super depressing to me.
Yeah, that's not
what I thought they were implying with that. Was that
to me? I think I guess the lesson that the filmmakers want you to walk away with is something quite different, right? Which is that we do live in this infinite universe, and we are seemingly completely small to the point of insignificance, but that we still make meaning out of the moments in our lives. And we do that, I think the film argues, by building relationships, right? Like one of my favorite quotes in the film is when somebody says, like, we're all useless alone. You know, being so small and so isolated, like being alone is to be nothing. Like, there's that moment where the mother and daughter hug at the end, and it's juxtaposed to planets colliding, which to me was like that's where I could have cried. It's such a commentary on parenthood and how hard it is, but also the way in which even like the smallest moments are
that was
powerful
the beauty
beyond words.
of the rock dimension with me. Was I mean, again, it's about as absurdist as the film gets. But just the idea of when she turns around with the googly eyes and she's like, "I'm going to come get you." I'm like, "What? Like, what's going on here?" And then when she, you know, Joy Rock rolls off the ground or off the cliff, and then she rolled that was another beautiful moment. And I mean, there is that difference in that we do kind of see the family, I guess, more united at the end,
right?
Which is good. But yeah, it's there's, you know, the idea of, you know, the fighting with kindness. You know, that works for me, you know, that works on the level of metaphor. I don't know, and maybe I have to go back and watch the film again. I don't know what that looks like in the reality of the characters' lives. And I wish there was something in the film that maybe just a little bit more. And again, maybe it's too hard to imagine. But I kind of wish there was something a little bit more. But
that's where I wish the movie would push us, Patrick, is not to say, what does it look like in the film? What we ought to be asking is, what does it look like in our lived experience? Like, what does it look like in the world in which we live? And as Americans who have this preponderance of power in the world, right? Or as white Americans who have this preponderance of power within the United States, it is, I think, you know, a moral imperative that we do that. And it's hard. Like what you're saying, you're absolutely right, Patrick. Imagining that is really hard, but it doesn't mean we ought not try to do it. To me, the way the film juxtaposes absurdity, like Raccacoonie.
Oh my God, that was my second favorite. When she said Raccacoonie, I'm like, what? I'm like, what is that? And then when the raccoon shows up, I'm like, oh my God, like we're actually doing Ratatouille with a raccoon. I'm like,
oh my God.
But the way in which the movie juxtaposes absurdity and like a search for truth just made it all the more resonant with me.
Yeah, it did. I mean, again, if I'm putting on my critical hat.
Yes, please.
I hate that.
It's much easier to imagine the absurdity than what that absurdity translates into reality.
Yeah. And what does that say about who we are and how we're frittering away you know, the short experiences we have on this planet.
Yeah, and let me be clear. Like, you know, this is not an aspect of the film that ruined it for me. I get it.
Oh, no.
It is a brilliant film, and it succeeds on so many levels. This is
such a good movie.
It is. Like, and it's one of the best movies I've seen. It's just that, you know, when I start to think, and again, like I said, I really liked the sort of, as you said, the kind of philosophical, moral kind of point about, you know, the importance of being kind, you know, even if nothing matters, and even if more things are going to happen and be discovered to make us feel like we matter even less, that the kindness matters. Like that again, that's a message that very powerfully resonated, with me, and there's so much this I think and I think you'd agree, Alan, you know, there's so much of this film that resonates with us both professionally and personally. Like it works both on kind of these levels of, you know, the kinds of things that we've dedicated our lives to studying, but also to just who we are as people.
Yeah, I don't think we're as far apart as, you know, it might seem.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying, you know, I'm not saying this is where the film completely falls apart and it's a disaster because of this. It's
right.
You know, well, it's a small kind of blind spot in the film for me.
It runs the risk of too happy an ending, and I can't disagree with you. I mean, all the arguments I just made to try to reclaim it. Yeah.
In terms of translating what the film has done into real action. You know, I would have liked to have seen more of that translation be in the film, or at least hint at it, rather than leaving it all to... Because my fear is that without seeing something like it in the real world of the film, or the story world of the film, I should say, it makes it that much bigger a leap to connect that story world and what it's saying to our world. Like, there's a little bit... just seeing a little bit more of a bridge, I think, is what I would have liked to have seen.
Yeah, and to me, that lack of a bridge is a really important commentary of how little effort we've given to imagining something different.
Yeah, I can see that as well. That it does kind of speak to, you know, again, and it may be unfair to tell these filmmakers, you know, why didn't you figure out what to do when we haven't figured out what to do?
Right. It's the argument I made about the Marvel and DC cinematic universes in 9/11 and the War on Terror, right? Like if we're going to watch those movies to give us the solution,
I thought that was about the crimes of the Bush administration. Oh no, that was Dark Knight.
Well, the crimes of the Bush administration are a part of that essay, but not the subtotal of it. But like I end by saying kind of what you're saying, which is, I mean, if we're waiting for them to tell us how to fix our problems, they're not going to, right? Like our movies aren't going to fix them for us. Art like this can highlight problems and demonstrate problems and help us think through possible solutions. But ultimately, like, no movie is going to fix race relations in this country. Like, we need to then pick up the movie and do something about it in the world in which we live.
Yeah, and it's possible that Everything Everywhere All at Once took us about as far along that path as it could.
I think, sadly, that might be true. But I also, if I had any criticism, it's like the danger of this film is that the ending is a little too happy. Mm-hmm. Or not happy enough. It's just too pat, maybe. Yeah, you know, as they sit kind of, in that office. Yeah,
I agree. And that's kind of the whole be kind is a bit too pat of an answer.
It is. I agree.
Particularly to the real, I get it within the... You know, if your options are despair or violence, then yes, be kind is a good answer.
Right.
But it's a bit too pat of an answer when you move from that very sort of allegorical and absurdist element of the film to the reality of the film.
And that's kind of our fundamental problem today in the world in which we live, not the story world. But in our world, you know, is like the answers are all too pat. And, you know, the work is hard to try to imagine something different. Yeah. Anyway, this movie, like as much as I enjoyed Licorice Pizza, and I probably talked too much on this podcast about how much I really enjoyed
I did not like Licorice Pizza.
Well, at least we agree on this one. Like this is
Yes.
They're both films that are trying to do something, I think, different. They're both films that are, given what we've been kind of slogging through in the MCU, and God knows, I guess She-Hulk is coming soon enough, right?
The reviews, the early reviews on She-Hulk have been overwhelmingly positive. So
I saw the same, that people think it's pretty funny and well made. So let's
I'm cautiously
hope.
optimistic that it's going to be that we're going to have that. We're going to have Wakanda Forever, and Phase 4 is going to end on a good note.
But there still is something about a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once that's puts it in a different category.
Yeah.
Like the Marvel films, and it's okay, you know, that Marvel wants to make more broadly popular films. I love the ambition here to make a film that has all the hallmarks of multiverses and, you know, beautifully choreographed kung fu sequences and like all the action adventure stuff we expect. And then you get in the theater and you're like, holy shit, like this is about something very, very different.
Well, and there is at least a kind of tangential connection between this film and the Marvel Universe in that the Russo brothers are the one that paid to produce this film.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, I mean, and kind of looking at, I kind of did a little bit of digging into A24, the studio behind the film.
Right.
Yeah,
the stuff they've done is impressive. Like they're behind Lady Bird, they're behind Ex Machina, they're behind The Green Knight, they're behind Midsommar, they're behind Moonlight, and they're behind this. Like it's an incredible.
No, when A24 pops up on the screen, like you generally know.
Like that's I think this might be the first A24 film I've seen.
You didn't see Lady Bird?
No, I didn't see Lady Bird. I didn't see Ex Machina. No,
you didn't see Ex Machina?
Wow. I didn't think Ex
stunning.
Machina was that good.
I know. Ex Machina, it shows, I think it's on HBO Max now. It's like, oh, I should watch that.
But then Patrick didn't see it.
Yeah.
It seems like a movie that's very much in your wheelhouse.
Yes, I agree.
Surprise to me.
Yeah. No, it kind of was, under the radar.
Yeah.
For me. But yeah, like, A24, and again, Everything All at Once is their highest grossing film. Not that numbers matter. But, you know, it's nice to see the film finding a great deal of success. And a film that very much deserves, you know, the success and the accolades.
Absolutely. When it came to the theaters, I knew I wanted to see it. And then, the spring semester was not a good semester.
Yeah, and also COVID and
right.
You know, there's just lots of reasons. Yeah.
Right. It just didn't happen. And you said, Patrick, like, we should do this for the podcast. And I'm so glad you did, because otherwise I don't know when I would have gotten to this movie. And it just, like, it refreshes my faith in cinema and even, like, popular cinema, right? Like, this is a movie that's made some money.
Yeah, there's just some indie feature that just, like, you know, some people talk as a cult classic or something. Like,
it's got a lot of Oscar buzz.
Popular cinema can do more than just entertain. I mean, the entertainment part is important, obviously, but it can do more than just that. Like, it can really push us to think about the world in more complicated ways and have maybe some conversations that we really ought to be having.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I know we've gone a bit long, but what were the opinions of the visual effects in general compared to, like, because we make comparisons to Marvel and MCU and stuff.
I love the visual effects. I thought
a
lot of the moments, like where they flash one image over another. I just thought it felt sometimes to me like a 70s art film. There was nothing about this film, Rich, that I didn't just.
Do you want to guess how many people were involved in making the effects?
Well, that seems like a very odd question. So it's got to be a low number, right?
That's I'm thinking.
This is another one of the Amazon little factoids that I got.
I'm going to say 8. I don't know.
I'm going to say 10.
You are double the amount, Patrick.
Wow, I was going to say 5. Wow. Damn it.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it was one of the
you tried to Price is Right me there.
I did. I should have done $1. Damn it! Why did I do $1?
Hang on, because I was just reading. Oh, so this is the director made Swiss Army Man.
Yes. Yeah.
And he had said when he worked
also, I think, aren't they also the ones behind Crazy Rich Asians?
Yes.
Yeah.
But, like, he had said he had hated working with a production house, like, do the effects or whatever because it was so impersonal. So it was like him and like again, I think it said like 5 people did almost 80% of the visual effects shots.
Well, to me, a lot of the effects were also not special effects, but they were the way in which the camera was used and turned on
and that's what
off.
they talked about, is that they ended up doing a lot of
was
practical stuff that was then enhanced with like certain things and whatnot.
So when I say it feels like a 70s art house kind of film in some ways, like there's a reason for that, because they're not so, and maybe in a way that makes the film feel more human too. Like,
well, again, I loved it that there was so much of it that felt grounded and physical, and like, you know, again, you were talking
Kenobi.
about,
well,
you were talking about with Shang-Chi and like a bunch of the Marvel movies where at the end it's two CGI monsters just fighting.
It overwhelms the humanity. Yeah.
It's like what? It's just an empty space where they're gonna put, you know, computer effects. Whereas with this one, it's like stuff's happening and then it's enhanced by the effects, makes it look so much, like you said, grounded and physical.
Yeah.
I also do want to give a quick shout out to Ke Huy Quan.
You would, right? I would.
And sort of his return to this film, because his story, you know, his return to acting with this film, because his story is, you know, heartbreaking in a lot of ways, because he had he was short round in Indiana Jones Temple of Doom.
Oh, that's
right. And then he was in Goonies, and then, you know, he found himself just getting cast for stereotypical role after stereotypical role, and so he moved to behind the camera.
Right.
And it wasn't until Crazy Rich Asians, and he saw that in the theaters, that's what got him going back into acting, was that finally there were roles for Asian Americans. And so, you know, seeing him, you know, back on screen and doing such a great job. And you know, like, and that's Wayne, and having to switch between so many different characters, just like Michelle Yeoh did. Like, it was nice to see. That was another kind of a nice little element of the film. It was like, oh, it's nice to see him back.
Apparently, his fight scene where in the iOS was like just added in at the last minute.
But in a way, Patrick, that kind of suggests the kind of small progress we see in the IRS office. Perhaps, like if you think about it over the course of his career.
Yeah.
It's not like Hollywood is replete with great roles for Asian Americans.
No.
But not. Compare the era of Indiana Jones.
If they are they cast to Asian Americans, or they, you know, that's even the worst part.
You know, like it's a kind of progress that's completely inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps the film is again asking us to try to imagine something more ambitious and thoroughgoing.
Yeah.
So we watched the film that we loved.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I was very happy that I had a feeling. I mean, the moment I watched the film, I was like, okay, Alan's gonna you know, love this film.
There's no reason not to love this film,
because that was my fear after watching it. You know, after only finally watching it after so long, it came out and all the hype. I was like, oh, is this gonna film? Is this film gonna live up with the hype?
And it was like, we need something good.
I was a little bit worried with the way it was so overwhelming at the beginning. I'm like, oh my god, I don't know if I can make it through this film. Like, is this what it's going to be? So yeah, it was nice to not have for once to not have a film that had a lot of hype and a lot of positivity behind it to be disappointing. So this film was good on so many levels.
And to do a podcast where we don't just sound like Statler and Waldorf, you know, sitting up in the balcony.
This is why this sucks.
You know, it's been a long time, I think, since we sat down and we really could just celebrate something like this, which is plus it's good for the podcast, right?
I mean, to
demonstrate. We're not just curmudgeons.
If you set aside like streaming stuff, I'm not sure how far back we have to go to find a film we actually talked about because it certainly hasn't been anything in the MCU recently.
No, I've been pretty uniformly.
So it's nice to actually, you know, to get something that you know, we can actually talk about in positive terms, even if there are minor, you know, flaws in it for some of us.
I mean, that's great, because
we're academics,
minor flaws that you notice because it's so good.
Yeah,
we're academics, so I feel like it's almost impossible for us to just uniformly love anything, right? Like our entire training is to be like to pick things apart.